bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the October 7th, 2025 episode. My guest this week is Thomas Stagg. Thomas is a partner in Novogradac's Seattle Metro office. Anyone who has watched or listened to Tax Credit Tuesday before likely knows that we have Thomas back on the program whenever we're talking about rent and income limits. And today is no exception, as we're going to discuss the outlook for 2026 rent and income limits that we expect to be released on or about April 1st of 2026. Thomas is Novogradac's leading expert, and I would say perhaps, maybe not even perhaps, the nation's leading expert outside of people working in the Department of Housing and Urban Development on HUD rent and income limits. Our rent and income limit episodes are some of the most popular Tax Credit Tuesday recordings. Now, I think these episodes are always popular because the issue applies to all facets of the affordable rental housing community. Whether you're a developer, a lender, an investor, a syndicator, a property manager, an asset manager, and I could keep going, you certainly want to know what the allowable rent charges will be for your properties or for a given property. You also want to know what the maximum allowable income levels are for qualifying tenants. So why now? Why are we having Thomas on this week? Well, we're talking about rent and income limits this week because of the recent release of data that affects how these calculations are made. Now, one critical release was last month's 2024 one-year American Community Survey data. Now, we'll talk more about the significance of that, how that plays into the calculation in the course of the podcast. We're also going to talk about future key dates for additional data releases that will impact or will affect the 2026 rent and income limits. Now, as most of our audience knows, based on the release of the ACS data, Thomas is able to create ever more robust estimates for most areas as to what income and rent limits are likely to be next April. And we're obviously, in the course of this episode, going to discuss what Thomas is seeing right now with respect to April 2026 rent and income limits. More specifically, in today's episode, we'll start off by discussing the components of the calculation of those limits. And we'll discuss what we know now and what we are estimating now and what we don't know and can't estimate. Second, Thomas will share his view as to what the likely 2026 year-over-year increases in rent and income limits are for various areas. And then finally, we will talk about the upcoming data releases that will help further refine his estimates. As you can see, Thomas and I have a lot to discuss. So if you're ready, let's get started. Thomas, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be back.
So today is your 16th appearance on Tax Credit Tuesday.
Oh, it's Sweet 16. Did you buy me a car?
I did not, but in 5 more appearances, you'll be old enough to drink. So your last appearance was in April, and guess what you were talking about? Rent and income limits. And I will include a link to that April 2025 episode in today's show notes. Now, for our longtime listeners and viewers, they know that rent and income limits are just one of your many areas of expertise. That said, as a refresher for them, as a welcome to anyone new to Tax Credit Tuesday, please describe some of the services you provide to Novogradac clients.
Yeah, Mike, thanks. I think that some people think, oh, Thomas only does income limits. Then other people think, oh, Thomas only does trainings, or Thomas only does developer work. So I kind of do a lot of stuff here at Novogradac and Company. Work mainly with developers. I help them apply for tax credits. I help them through the final cost certification process. Then, of course, the annual audit and tax returns. But I also do a lot of this consulting work to keep things interesting with income limits and compliance monitoring testing, kind of everything that you could kind of need help with, I can help with.
So thank you for that. And I'll go a bit sort of off script here and don't get nervous. I'm not going to go too far off script. But maybe it'd be interesting, I think, for many of our listeners and other members of the audience to know how it is you came to be such an expert on the HUD rent income limit calculations, kind of roughly when you sort of jumped in and kind of what you've had to learn along the way.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It kind of started like a lot of things kind of by accident. So we have our rent income limit calculator that we've been updating for decades now. And I started out with assisting with the testing on that. But in order to understand if the calculator is working properly, I have to understand what the calculator is trying to do. So then I had to really get a good understanding of income limits and rent limits. But then beyond that, I started questioning, well, where do these limits come from? And so I started reading the HUD briefing materials, digging deep into their guidance, and really trying to understand the calculation. Now, people who have been doing this for a long time will understand 20 years ago, the calculation for income limits were very, very difficult. We're going to talk later about them. It's so much easier now. And back then, I really wanted to kind of figure out how to crack this nut. Could I recreate these? And it started out that a client actually hired us. They said, hey, Thomas, we want to pay you to try and recreate these. And I was like, yes, somebody wants to pay me to do something I want to do in my own free time anyways. And so we started really digging in and figuring out how to recreate the income limits. And then HUD simplified that formula so that now, we can really do it on a nationwide basis. But a lot of it is just really every year when they come out, rereading all that guidance to make sure we didn't miss something, to make sure HUD's not giving us any signals of how they're thinking about changing their mind in the future, and really just digging into it.
And this is one of the areas where I think for many years, not enough attention was given to the HUD and rent and income limits. And obviously they're HUD income limits from which we get the rent limits. So we refer to them as rent income limits, but they're really giving us income limits. But I feel like the industry itself for many, many years just sort of took them as, well, that's what they are. And every year it was a bit of a, let's see what they're going to say. And then, and I think even HUD in those rent and income limits, when they would release them, they would say, well, we're thinking of doing this, this, and that. And not many people pay very close attention to what we think is going to happen and what might change. And then pretty quickly you realize that if they were putting something out there, you needed to understand what that was going to mean, because that could mean dramatically different income calculations for a given area, which could dramatically affect rents, which is, if you have a property in service, obviously you may not like it. You may want to talk to HUD about not adopting that change. But if you were developing, you needed to know that information, so you would know what your initial rents are going to be, depending upon the time of your development and the rest. And I feel like now, thanks to your leadership on the Novogradac Rent and Income Limits Working Group, that there's now a greater awareness to the impact that these calculations have across the entire affordable housing community. And I said Rent and Income Limits Working Group, it's really the Income Limits Working Group. From which rent limits are generated. But so thank you for all your leadership there. So let's get back to our regular scheduled programming. So I wanted to start the conversation, as I said in the intro, with the recent release of the American Community Survey data. So if you could describe the significance of that data and how it's used in the calculation of the income limits. And let me just say, I mentioned the American Community Survey data. We usually refer to that, or often shorten that to say ACS data. So feel free to either use the longer version or just say the ACS data.
All right.
Take it away.
So the ACS data is kind of the starting point for our calculation. And what the American Community Survey is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a survey that happens every year, and they send out batches of questionnaires every month to residents of the United States. And in there's income data that people fill out. And then the Census Bureau collects that data throughout the entire year, and then they process it. And then finally in September, they've gathered all the data, processed it, and we get a sneak peek at what's happening with the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey does two really important things for us. First, it's the baseline for the calculation of area median income for every area in the country. So every area has an area median income. The basis of that is based on the American Community Survey. And then two, the American Community Survey, now after some changes, is what determines the cap for income limits. And I said, due to some changes, those who've been following along, the income limit cap has had some iterations over the last few years, but HUD has finally settled on saying the cap is going to equal 2 times the change. Well, the basis of the cap is going to be 2 times the change in the ACS national median income. And so really the cap, if you're following along, we just are talking about the 2024 American Community Survey data. So the cap is really based on the change between 23 and 24 income limits, which we've had various podcasts on the cap before, so I won't belabor that too much, but it's really interesting that our cap for 2026 is based on what happened between 23 and 24. But if we look at what happened between, so that it sets the cap, and if we look at what happened between 23 and 24, the American Community Survey data national median income went from roughly 96,000 to 101,000. So that's roughly a 5% change. And so if we look at that, it's 5.04%. So 2 times 5.04% is a little higher than 10%. Now HUD has a ceiling on the cap that says it shall never be more than 10%. So right now we know the cap for next year. That's set in stone. As much as anything is set in stone. HUD could change their mind and change the cap methodology, but assuming they don't, we know the cap for next year will be 10%. So ACS really allows us to start doing our calculations of our area median income for every area, but also put that in the perspective of, well, how does that compare to the cap that HUD has established?
And HUD, in recent years has always had a cap of 2 times national median income. Only a few years ago, they adopted this overriding 10%. And it is a bit coincidental that the doubling the national being 10.08 versus 10.
Right.
So even if they did away with the 10% cap this year, which we're not getting any indications they would, it would still be roughly 10%.
Right. There's not a big difference this year.
So you mentioned the American Community Survey data, the ACS data, and the release of sort of median incomes. However, that doesn't mean that necessarily is the income for their given area, because HUD makes various adjustments. So maybe describe, once you have this national median income number and the median income numbers by various areas, what adjustments HUD has to make to get to the 2026 rent and income limits. Now, let me just start by saying, given that you described, it's really the change between 23 and 24. It seems like, as I know, that you have to take those 2024 numbers and roll them forward.
Right.
And not be allowing current year rents based upon 2024 income levels. So please describe what goes into the sausage making there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The first point is it's the 2024 American Community Survey. And now I talked about how even having this data by September 2025 is actually pretty quick when you think about they're taking surveys. The last survey goes out in December. People have till April to respond to it. Then they have 5 months to turn around all this analysis of all the surveys they receive, millions of surveys. But the Census Bureau does that, and then HUD uses that data. People always ask, well, why does HUD use historic data? They're using the most current data they have available. So they're not making an intentional choice to use historic data, but we want to be as accurate as possible. So they want to base it off the American Community Survey, because that's what HUD feels like the most accurate information we have. But it's 2 years old. And so we need to trend it forward to 2026 somehow. And this is where HUD uses what we call a trend factor. And that trend factor, starting last year, is wages and salary data. Previous to that, it was consumer price index. And that made sense. We'd take the 2024 consumer price index, compare that to the 2026 consumer price index, and use that as our trend factor. Well, now we're doing something very similar. We're taking the wages and salary data from the Congressional Budget Office for 2024 and looking at how much that has changed to 2026. And that now is our trend factor. And HUD changed that trend factor because they thought that CPI wasn't the best reflection of what was happening with incomes. And so they thought the wages and salary data would be more accurate. And now we'll see. This is only our second year of using the wages and salary data. So we'll see if it's more accurate than the other trend factors, but we think it will be at least more in line with what's happening with income. Seems like it's a good data point to use. So that's number one. They're using that to trend that forward. But that gives us what we call area median income. We take American Community Survey, trend it forward. That gives us area median income. But for our tax credit programs, we use what's called very low income. And HUD has a series of adjustments that they apply to very low income. And we don't need to get into all the adjustments. I'll talk about kind of the two big ones. The two biggest ones are, well, first I'll say this. Every area is eligible for every adjustment. HUD calculates all these adjustments for every area and takes the highest of all the adjustments. And so we say an area may be a high housing cost area that we're going to talk about in a second. And it doesn't like fill out an application to become a high housing cost area and get stamped a high housing cost area. No, HUD just does their calculation. And if the high housing cost calculation is higher than 50% of area median income, well, now you're a high housing cost area, and we're going to use that higher number for you or higher figure. And so HUD has a series of adjustments. Might as well talk about high housing costs first because I mentioned that. That's an adjustment where HUD says if rents are a disproportionate percentage of people's income in an area, then more people need assistance. So we're going to inflate up the income limit so that more people qualify. And they do this on a calculation based on the fair market rents that HUD publishes. So if you have high fair market rents compared to what the median income for your area is, your incomes will get bumped up so that more people can qualify for assistance. The second big adjustment is the state non-metro. And that's an adjustment that says no area in a state can have an income limit that's less than the non-metropolitan median income for that state. They want to have all areas kind of have this floor in the state so that you don't have really low counties. And as farm workers are traveling between counties, they can't qualify, then they can. So they kind of set this state non-metropolitan median income floor. And then, of course, we have, as we've already mentioned, the caps and the floors and decreases. So year over year, HUD wants to limit the changes that an area has. And the first one is a floor. You'll never meet less than 5% of what you were the previous year, or I should say 95% of what you were the previous year, a 5% decrease. And then they have the cap, as we've already talked about, and that cap is dynamic. The cap will never be less than 5% and never greater than 10%. And then it falls between 5 and 10%, depends, as we've already mentioned, on the change in the ACS, national median income. And so HUD does all these adjustments to income limits so that we arrive at very low income.
So is it safe to say that you start off with, in essence, AMI as of 2024 based upon ACS, that gets inflated to what I'll call AMI for 2026, and that AMI for 2026 then gets adjusted by these high housing costs, state non-metro, and the 95% floor and the 10% cap?
Yep, that's correct.
And I will just note for anyone new to the audience that when Thomas says the area, the very low income can't go down by more than 5%, well, actually, I'll ask you the question, even though I know the answer. I could see someone listening to that and saying, does that mean my rents are going to go down 5%?
Oh, yes. Great point.
So talk about the rent floor.
Yeah. So these are the income limits published by HUD. And number one, as we've mentioned a few times, HUD only publishes income limits. They don't publish rent limits. And then the Internal Revenue Code tells us that once a project is in service for tax credits, its rents shall never decrease. You're held harmless. So if you're in an area that was, $50,000 this year, and then the HUD published a decrease down to $47,500, a 5% decrease, that's what HUD's going to publish. And that's the income limit for any new project. And they would base their rent limit on that. But your project, you're held harmless. So you'd continue to qualify tenants at $50,000. So tenants that are making between $47,500 and $50,000 could still qualify to live in your project. And your rents would still be based on your held harmless rents of $50,000, based on $50,000. So the rents that are derived from that.
And I won't ask you to go into all the nuances, but just to our audience, if you have properties under development, kind of locking in that rent floor can be pretty significant. So make sure you're talking to your tax advisor about that. And then let me also go down this rabbit hole one little bit more, because now I mentioned before, someone who's less sophisticated might be thinking your rents could go down. Someone more sophisticated would say, no, I know there's this rent floor. Someone even more sophisticated would say, but wait a second, what about utility allowances? And utility allowances can go up, which would cause you to actually have a slight decrease in net rent because your allowance for your rental amounts gets adjusted downward by some utility allowance for tenants. And if that's rising, when you have a floor, there's a marginal decrease in
Right.
the net rent.
Yeah, it's your gross rents that are held harmless. As you certainly pointed out, your net rents can erode over time due to increasing utility costs.
Okay, let's get out of that rabbit hole. But I anticipate there are a few people listening kind of going down those different paths. And for those that haven't done those paths before, it was a good exercise. So Thomas, now that we have a better understanding of HUD's sort of very low income limits, kind of post-adjust all the different adjustments, let's move to the various things that we know and don't know. And I sort of, in my own mind, was thinking of it as sort of three parts. There's some parts of HUD's calculation of very low income limits that we now know for certain. And there are parts of it where we have pretty good estimates. And there are areas where we don't have estimates. And we're not really in a position to create reasonable sort of estimates. So if you could talk about what we know for certain, where we have estimates that we know will change over time, but we think we have pretty good estimates, and those areas where we don't have estimates and we know information will be coming in due course.
Yeah. So I think I like to look at this as to our components of what goes into calculation. So American Community Survey, that data is not going to change. So we know that amount. Now I'm going to come back and talk about some areas that we don't know that 100%, but for the most part, we know American Community Survey data. The next piece of data is that trend factor, that inflation factor. And since 2026 isn't here yet, I don't know what the wages and salary data for 2026 is going to be yet. But Congressional Budget Office publishes their 10-year economic projection, and that's where this information comes from. And so right now we're using the 10-year economic projection that was done in, I should look this up, it was either March or April of this year. And we were hoping to get an update in September. And HUD did publish an update, but their update, they didn't do their full 10-year economic projection. They did their scaled down 2-year economic projection. So when Congressional Budget Office published that, it did not include this wages and salary per capita information that we were used for this calculation. So when we talk about numbers later on, we are still using the January CBO estimate. But what's interesting about that is this simplified projection that they put out, it did not include the wages and salary data, but it had a different line that was called, oh shoot, now I'm going to forget the name. I'm on the spot now. It was called something along of private sector wages. And private sector wages, basically from their January projection to their September projection, stayed the same. So that was a hint to us that, okay, while we know that our trend factor will be updated again, likely in January of next year, will be the one that HUD uses, we feel like CBO is not estimating big changes in wages right now from January to September, and likely not from September to January next year. So the trend factor is unknown. The trend factor obviously plays a part in our calculation. And so that's why we never say our calculations are going to be exactly right on. But historically, that trend factor hasn't swung a lot. And so, as we say, these are robust estimates, but they're not going to be 100%. So that's going to AMI. We know the ACS data. We don't know the trend factor. And then we start looking at these HUD adjustments, and kind of the same thing, the HUD adjustments, the high housing cost adjustments based on fair market rents. Well, HUD released fair market rents in September, so we now know those numbers exactly. So any area that's a high housing cost area, we know that with precision. Now, as we talked about, there could be an adjustment that could push something above that, but we know it will be no less than this number we published. And so those areas we know you're going to get at least this number, regardless of what happens with trend factors or other adjustments, you'll hit at least here. And so in the state non-metro, similarly, we have the ACS data that we use to calculate that as well. So realistically, our weak spot is, obviously, we don't know the trend factor, but nobody does. The second area that we are running into issues with estimates right now is the fact that we only have the 1-year American Community Survey data. And this is getting ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but in December, they released the 5-year American Community Survey data. And so right now we only have the 1 year, so we can only estimate about 80% of the population. The remaining 20% of the population are in areas that rely on a 5-year estimate. And why does HUD use the 5-year estimate? They use it when a 1-year estimate is unreliable, which typically means they didn't get enough survey respondents in an area. So it means usually small geographic areas. So that's one spot where you don't have estimates yet, but we'll have those in December. The second place where we do estimates, but they have a little more caveats with them, is when HUD has what's called an HUD Metropolitan Fair Market Rent Area, abbreviated to HMFA. This is where HUD takes an MSA and carves it up into smaller areas to better match the the commuting patterns and the socioeconomic impacts of the areas. And when HUD does that, it depends how they carve it up. If they carve it up into two, we have a 2-county MSA and they split it into 2 separate county HMFAs, great. We can do the calculation on county because we can get that from ACS. But when they take a 10-county MSA and split it up into 3 areas or 2 areas with 3 counties and 1 area with 4 counties, well, now we can't go to American Community Survey and pull the data for those 4 counties as a group. Then we have to do a little bit of weighting on it. We have to weight it based on various methodologies that HUD has weighted the individual counties in that HMFA in the past. And so we're just adding a little bit more of assumptions into our calculation. So obviously when we do that, we add a little bit of more variability into our calculation. And so those areas, we let people know when they're purchasing them that these are HMFAs, so they're not going to be as accurate as a single county estimate would be or an MSA estimate. But beyond that, we pretty much can estimate every area in the country. Now, there are a few places in New England where they go down to the town level where we just can never get it to match up well enough that we can issue a robust estimate. And so we just don't, because we don't want to give somebody an estimate that is just a wild guess. We always want to make sure we're grounded in fundamental data that we have fact checked over the last few years to make sure it's robust.
So you mentioned the 1-year ACS data, and you said there's roughly 80% of the country that we have estimates that can be relied on, and you're not waiting for the 5-year data like you are for the other 20%, which of course, you can't really talk about that without thinking of COVID and the COVID year where there were no 1-year, there were no estimates that HUD wanted to rely on. But how does this year compare to prior years in terms of the 80%, 20% coverage? And how significant is that 20% piece in terms of number of projects, number of residents, and the like?
Yeah, so it's very comparable to prior years, the percentage of the population that we can cover after the 1-year release. In fact, this year, we're actually a little bit higher because we've been able to figure out a better way to estimate the state non-metro income. So we're actually picking up a lot more areas now than we have in the past. So that 80-20 split's fairly consistent. Now, obviously the number of people who live in those areas is 20%, but the number of low-income tenants and the number of projects, I haven't been able to quantify that because I haven't gone back and compared this data set to a data set of where all the properties are located. But if we kind of look at our track record of who's ordering income limits, it's more than 80% of the orders are in areas that we can cover because we can cover the major geographic areas.
Now
I'd venture to guess that less than 20% of the properties are located in areas that we can't estimate.
So this has all been really interesting, particularly for me from a technical perspective. And I always enjoyed discussing the nuances of the rent and income limits. Something tells me the listening audience right now and the viewing audience is saying, great, 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 great. I've invested all this time in this podcast. Now, can you tell me what you're actually seeing out there?
Right.
Please tell me, give me an advanced look at the 2026 income limits.
Yeah. So I'm going to tease you one more time here. I'm going to say, okay, ACS data changed by 5%, but this trend factor we're talking about is trending, without going way off into the weeds here, is trending slower than it has in prior years because wage growth has slowed down. So the trend factor is actually a slower trend factor. And so on average, area median income is changing by about 2.4%. Now, if HUD didn't have any additional adjustments they made, that would be the change. But as we've talked about, VLI has these additional changes. So once we apply high housing costs, state non-metro, caps, and floors, we actually end up with an average change in VLI that's right around 4% for the areas that we can estimate. And now that's actually fairly good news when you put it in context of VLI is only changing by 2%. So we're about doubling that. And 4% is still kind of higher than we've probably been underwriting our projects at. So still kind of steady growth, which is good for tenants who are trying to qualify, right? Steady growth helps tenants qualify. Steady growth in rent, a 4% increase is good, steady rent increases, predictable for tenants, good for property organization, property management. But what's interesting is there's always that dichotomy in the areas, right? So we look and we say 10% of the areas that we can estimate are going to be capped this year. So 10% would be growing by greater than 10%, but for the cap. So we know we have some areas that are having really high growth still. And about 2% of the areas are floored, which actually good news. We want the floored numbers to be as small as possible. And 2% is a pretty low percentage. So 2% are floored. And so it's really important that you understand where in that range you lie, right? Are you going up by 10, down by 5, or are you the 4% average? And that's why it's so important to kind of do these estimates on that local level, because these national changes are great and informational, and people love them on the podcast, but what really matters is what's happening to your specific area.
No, that's absolutely right. And it's hard to extrapolate the average of 4%, all portfolio, even portfolio wide, can be
Right.
notably different depending upon where how you're weighting the various increases. Is there anything more you wanted to say about the sort of averages and with respect to the 4%? I mean, it basically seems like 88% of the projects are between the cap and the floor.
Right. It's kind of funny how that worked out this year. I think it's good to put it in context. This is the lowest increase we've had in the last, I'd probably say 6-7 years. We've been bumping into areas where we've been averaging 9% increase, 8% increase. So it's going to be a little bit slower, but it's still, I think, robust growth. If we go back to what we were seeing in the late 2000s, we'd be seeing years where 40% of the areas had decreases. And so this is still very strong growth, even though it's more sustainable 4% growth, as opposed to kind of that 9% we've been seeing. But I think that it still is a good point to point out that it's nice, steady growth, and your projects on average are going to be around 4%, which is keeping up with inflation.
And not to kind of further sort of confuse matters, but these are particularly relevant on a new development that doesn't have any existing rents in place and the like. For those properties that are up and running, there still are a large number of properties where they're not at maximum rents now because of during COVID, they went a raise and they ended up having sufficient increases that now they're kind of more measured and their annual increases. And then obviously states like California have caps on what those annual increases can be. So I would say, a few years ago, it was more 1-to-1 in terms of the allowable increases and what projects would receive. Now there's a few more hurdles in the way, such that the actual property managers and asset managers and the rest have to be looking at those issues as well as they're looking at 2026 rent and income limit adjustments. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely that, we talk about this kind of just in context of the limits, but the actual rent charges at your project could look significantly different. There's the COVID impact, there's local market impact, there's rent caps in place by your local jurisdiction, all those things that property managers have to look at in determining this. And it's so much easier on a new project because we're not impacting any residents, right? So if you're a 10%, if you're one of those areas that are capped and you're a new project, you're likely going to come to market, assuming market can bear it, at the 10% cap. If you're an existing project that got a 10% increase, you're probably not passing 10% on to your tenants. You're probably doing as units turn over, et cetera. And so, it doesn't mean that revenue is going to go up by 10% this year. It's important to think about all these impacts that play into this.
That's very good. It's also, this podcast can also just serve as a catalyst for the property managers and the asset managers and syndicators and the rest to be thinking through all of these sorts of issues. So when the limits do come out in April, they can kind of hit the ground running in terms of implementing them, having a policy in place. They can implement them in ways that they think is best for themselves and their tenants.
Yep. And gives you more time to think about that, because April 1st, when the limits come out, you want to implement those. You want to have a plan in place already. So
Exactly.
having bought this data set today, you can start looking at your various projects and saying, okay, this one, we want to do this one, we want to do this strategy.
That's right. No, you definitely want to be thoughtful about it. So thank you, Thomas. So we've talked about where we are now. Now for the last part of our discussion, I mentioned in the coming months, additional information sort of coming out. And you've mentioned the 5-year ACS data, and you've mentioned the January update potentially to the trend factor. Maybe expand on those or clarify those, and any other key dates between now and April.
Yeah. So the first big one's 5-year American Community Survey in December. And what's important to note about that is that's not going to impact any of the calculations we've already done. It's just going to expand the sample to pick up the rest of this 20% population. So that's an expansion release. Whereas the CBO release that will come out in January, every area uses the same trend factor based on that CBO, sorry. And so when that comes out in, I say January, it has range anywhere from January to March. And in 1 year, they didn't even do it. And so hopefully we'll see it in January because that gives us more time to update our estimates and people to kind of respond to that as they're making this plan. So those are the two big data releases that we're kind of looking forward to. The other thing to be aware of is that sometimes HUD does change their calculations. And usually they signify that somewhere between 120 and 90 days in advance. Usually we would have already had some word of it now and in some other releases, some hints, but if they are planning any changes, we'd be looking around a January release of a notice of information so that the income limits working group and other advocacy groups could respond to that. And so we'd be looking for that. And that could happen, anytime from December till the income limits come out. But, that'd be the other kind of data that we'd be expecting. And then April 1st is HUD's target date. And now, of course, as we're in the midst of a government shutdown right now, people might be wondering, is April 1st still what date you're anticipating? And I'd say as of right now, we're still anticipating April 1st. I think the further away the shutdown is from the income limits release and the shorter the shutdown is, the less impact it will have on the income limits. And so if we have a relatively short shutdown here, and I don't know either way, it's likely will have little impact on the income limits. But if that shutdown is extended, then typically HUD would say it's a day for day change in the number of days that were shut down will change the income limit released by those number of days. But to me, since we're so far away from that, it's going to depend on how long this shutdown stays in place.
And the day for day, wasn't that when we had the 30-some day shutdown in January where it was getting close to the April date? So it was it was almost like a 1-for-1 because it was so close to the release date.
Right. And so it's interesting, they definitely have a tight window, right? They have the American Community Survey data out. So right now is when they would be working on the calculation and then pushing up to approvals. So I think what happens is the time window that they're working on the calculation slides, it's going to be a question of how quickly it can get through approvals. And so if the approvals can go quickly, they can still meet the deadline. But obviously right now is when they would be calculating it. And so that calculation is going to happen later than it would otherwise.
And I was sort of thinking that back in January when they had to take the December release and then the January CBO update, and then they have a shutdown for 30 days.
Well, yeah, I definitely would say if we're in January talking about the shutdown, I'd say absolutely we should anticipate day for day. Here, I don't think I'm thinking day for day, but I just want to caution people that it could have an impact because this is when HUD would start working on it.
Yeah, no, I think you expressed that pretty clearly. I was just kind of walking down memory lane.
Yes.
And trying to generate post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic stress. So let's just turn now to other ways in which folks can sort of stay engaged and monitor these income limit resources. Let me start just by saying I will include Thomas's contact information in the show notes. If you have any questions about income limits or other law enforcement tax credit related questions from application to audit and tax and the rest, please reach out to Thomas. He is a tremendous resource. But Thomas, please describe other resources available.
Yeah, so obviously we've talked about a few times with the rent income limit estimator. You can order your individual areas to see what's happening. That's live on our website right now. And then the income limit working group. The income limit working group started back in 2020 to kind of respond to data issues with the American Community Survey. But since then, it's grown to really look at various HUD published data and the way that it interacts with low-income housing tax credits and our other programs. And we continue to kind of work on issues. Right now, we're doing a comment letter to HUD to talk about these adjustments we talked about, if we think that any should be tweaked or adjusted or other adjustments HUD should be considering. So we're trying to be very proactive with HUD. HUD joins us at our working group calls during the year. And so it's a great group if you're interested in HUD income limits, QCT, DDAs, fair market rents, those sort of data sets. I'd encourage you to, get more information about the income limits working group, because we should really just call it the HUD working group, but then people think it's for HUD audits, but it's really all HUD data sets are what the group is interested in. And then of course, we'll be talking about income limits, I'm sure, at our Las Vegas conference. And you can look for us there as well.
No, and you have a great group. There are many developers, many syndicators, many property managers that all have, the appropriate person in their organization that's in charge of asset management or property management. Being represented on that committee. I remain surprised that we don't have even more, because it seems like you really can't do asset management. You can't do underwriting of a property without knowing what the future of income and rent limits are. And it seems like anyone who's in this for the long haul needs to have someone who's expert in how these calculations work and what changes could be on the horizon, because they have such an impact on underwriting, valuation, cash flow, and the rest. So I do encourage everyone who's viewing or listening to make sure someone within your organization is a member of the income limits working group, if for no other reason to ensure none of your competitors know information that you don't know, but more significantly, so you can better manage your processes, as well as participate in comment letters and the like, to try to sort of bend the curve in ways that's best for the affordable housing community, the residents, and the like. So Thomas, thank you for those suggestions. I will include a link to those items in today's show notes. Please do stick around for our off mic section. But before we go to that, to our audience, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Tax Credit Tuesday or whatever platform you get your podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, please take a quick moment just to like. And if you want to spend a little bit more than a quick moment, comment on the video as well. By you liking and or commenting on the video, that helps raise our visibility. Also, I encourage you to share the podcast with colleagues. It's always an excellent way for your colleagues to stay current on a variety of the tax incentives that we cover on the podcast. And we do have a full archive of episodes available on our website. And we often find that people will binge watch episodes, or have those that have recently joined the organization binge watch some of the episodes to get up to speed on the various tax incentives that we cover. So with that, let's turn to the off mic section. And this is an area that we like to give a shout out to others working in the community development community. And it's an opportunity to highlight some of the good work that's being done out there that is worthy of recognition. So Thomas, who would you like to shout out?
Yeah, Mike, I'm sure you've been following along closely, but a lot of states are adopting 25% policies to try and use this additional incentive. I just wanted to give a shout out to Marina at TCAC and her staff, who really proactively issued policies to try and maximize the amount of bonds that are becoming 2026 bonds and therefore can qualify for the 25% test. They proactively worked with projects that already had allocations in 2025 to reduce their request down to a 30% level, and then took those extra bonds back and gave them out in their third round this year to all be issued in 2026, so they can all qualify for the 25% test. I'd say conservative estimates are showing that they're going to do 4 times as many projects in the third round as they would have done if they had not adopted this, which is just amazing. The number of additional units. I know that we've been playing around some calculations, but the number of additional units that are going to be generated because of this in 1 year in California, it's going to be amazing. And there's other states who are proactively going after this as well. So I wanted to give my shout out to TCAC and Marina for the great work that they did.
And let me echo that shout as well. I do think California set an amazing example in ways in which you could leverage the lowering of the 50% test to be able to finance more low-income units, notably more, thousands more low-income units. And I know it didn't come without a lot of effort and a lot of work. So I really appreciate the efforts that those in the various state housing agencies are making to implement the lowering of the 50% test as quickly and wisely as possible. And it's actually coincidental, because I don't think you know this, Thomas, but my Washington Wire that I'm writing right now for November is all about how states need to act quickly and wisely to maximize the benefits of the lowering of the 50% test. And something tells me that Marina's efforts in California will be noted.
Mike, then I'll mention that you might know this, but we're doing a webinar tomorrow on Wednesday on acquisition rehab, which I think will be a big part of the 25% test. And we're building in some information about how the 25% test works well with acquisition rehab. And so it's a very important topic. And so I think similar to you, we're trying to be proactive and getting as much information out there as to how people can implement this.
No, and I'm really glad that webinar is happening, because one of my fears with respect to the lowering of the 50% test is a lot of states might say, well, we can't scale the soft financing and we want to use our bonds for new construction. And since we can't scale the soft financing, maybe there's not as much demand in our state to handle a doubling. And in those states that have been focused on new construction, a lot of preservation projects haven't been able to apply because they know they weren't going to win. And there's this backlog. And when I hear about like demand for bonds and all the rest, a lot of people talk about the demand they can see through oversubscription or applications in excess of those they can fund. But that's just the observed demand. There's this shadow demand of projects that want to apply, but don't apply because they are not going to be competitive. So I would encourage states to assume there's more. If you're oversubscribed or at parity now, assume that there's more demand than you're seeing. There can't be less demand. There's always potential for more demand, and in some states, it's going to be dramatically more demand. And there's been a real need for preservation financing in a large number of states. And as you know, this lowering of the 50% test creates the potential for some of that demand to be filled. So thank you for bringing on the podcast today, Thomas. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.